The wagon door hadn't even swung shut behind her before Josephine Callahan understood the truth nobody had dared put in a letter. A dead woman's shawl sat folded on the porch chair. Her boots stood by the door, laces still tied, waiting for feet that would never fill them again. Wyatt Marsh hadn't sent for a wife. He'd sent for a stranger to guard a shrine. And when he finally looked at her, truly looked, his first words weren't welcome. They were a warning. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. Drop the name of the city you're watching from below so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach driver didn't even climb down to help her with the trunk. "This is Stone Creek, ma'am," he said, already turning the horses. "Marsh Ridge is a mile up that road. I ain't going no further." Josephine Callahan stood in the dust with her trunk at her feet and stared up at the sign hanging crooked over the general store. Stone Creek, Colorado Territory. A stand. 1861. Nobody had come to meet her. She had written ahead. She had told him the date, the hour, the coach line. And still nobody had come. She was 29 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that waiting for someone to notice her was a fool's game. So she gripped the handle of her trunk, hauled it against her hip, and started walking. By the time she reached the gate of Marsh Ridge Ranch, her arms ached and her dress was soaked through at the collar. A woman was standing on the porch with a broom in her hand, watching her come up the road, like she was something the wind had blown in and ought to be swept back out. "You lost," the woman called. "I'm looking for Wyatt Marsh," Josephine said. "I'm Josephine Callahan. He's expecting me." The woman's face didn't change, but her knuckles went white around the broom handle. "Nobody told me he was expecting anybody. We've been writing for 4 months. Writing." The woman said the word like it tasted bad. "Well, you'd best come in then since you've walked all this way. I'm Mrs. Pruitt. I keep this house." A pause, sharp as a blade. "I keep it exactly the way it's meant to be kept." Josephine climbed the porch steps, and that was when she saw it. A woman's shawl, pale blue, folded with more care than anyone folds a thing. They still use resting on a rocking chair that hadn't rocked in a long while. Beside it, a pair of small leather boots, laces tied in neat bows, set by the door like their owner had just stepped out of them and would be back any minute. "Whose are these?" Josephine asked, though some part of her already knew. Mrs. Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Those belong to Anna Marsh, Mr. Marsh's wife." His wife. His first wife, Mrs. Pruitt corrected, and there was something almost like satisfaction in the correction, like she'd been waiting to say it. She passed 3 years back. Fever took her quick end of one summer to the start of the next winter she was gone. Mr. Marsh keeps her things exactly where she left them. Nobody touches that shawl. Nobody touches those boots. Nobody sits in that chair. Josephine looked past the porch through the open door into the front room. A woman's shawl on a hook. A book left open on a side table, its pages beginning to yellow, as if someone meant to come back and finish the chapter. A hairbrush on a shelf with strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles. It wasn't a home. It was a museum built around a grief so large it had swallowed the whole house. "Mrs. Pruitt," Josephine said carefully, "did Mr. Marsh tell you why I'm here?" "I know why you're here." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes swept over her slow and cold, taking in every inch her travel-worn dress, straining at the seams, her broad shoulders, the soft roundness of her that no corset in the world was built to hide. "He wrote for a bride to help run this place. I just didn't expect—" She stopped herself. "You didn't expect what?" "Nothing." But her eyes said everything. They said too big, too plain, too much woman for a man who'd loved someone slim and quiet and gone. "You'd best wait out here. I'll fetch him." Josephine stood alone on that porch for 11 minutes. She counted every one of them, because counting was easier than thinking about the shawl or the boots or the way Mrs. Pruitt's eyes had measured her, and found her wanting before she'd said a single word beyond her own name. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Mrs. Pruitt. He was taller than she'd pictured from 4 months of careful letters, with a jaw that hadn't been shaved in a day or two, and eyes the gray of a sky before a storm decides which way it's going to break. He looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he can't pay. Not cruel, just tired, just resigned to something he didn't want. "You're Josephine." "I am." She held out her hand. "You must be Wyatt." He looked at her hand like he wasn't sure what to do with it, then shook it once quick, like touching her too long might mean something he wasn't ready for. "You made good time." "Nobody came to meet the coach." Something flickered across his face, not quite an apology. "I had a fence down in the north pasture. Lost half a day's work chasing cattle through it." He glanced at the trunk still sitting where she'd dropped it. "That everything you brought? It's everything I own." He nodded slowly, like that answered a question he hadn't asked out loud. "Well, you'd best come in then." She stepped past him into the front room, and up close the shrine was worse. A woman's portrait hung over the mantel, small, dark-haired, delicate, in a way Josephine would never be delicate, smiling out at a room that had stopped living the day she had. "That's Anna," Wyatt said before she could ask. His voice had gone flat, careful, like a man walking across thin ice. "My wife. Mrs. Pruitt told me." "Then Mrs. Pruitt told you the rules too, I expect." "She mentioned some of them. I'll say them plain so there's no confusion." He crossed his arms, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that porch, he looked directly at her. Not measuring her, not judging her, just looking like he needed her to understand something important. "Nothing in this house gets moved. Not her shawl, not her books, not her chair. You'll sleep in the room at the end of the hall, not the front bedroom. That room stays as it is." "As a shrine." His eyes narrowed. "As it is." "Mr. Marsh?" Josephine kept her voice steady, though her hands tucked into her skirts were shaking. "I traveled 600 miles because your letters told me you needed a wife. A partner. Someone to help you run this ranch and share your life. Not a housekeeper who's forbidden from breathing wrong in her own home. This isn't your home." The words came out fast, harder than he seemed to mean them, and he looked almost surprised at himself for saying them. He softened, just slightly. It's a place you'll live and work. And in return, you'll have a roof and food, and my name if the town asks. That's the arrangement. That's what I wrote." "You wrote that you were lonely." He flinched like she'd struck him. "I did," he admitted. "But loneliness and readiness ain't the same thing, ma'am. I buried a wife 3 years ago. I ain't looking to replace her. I'm looking for help keeping this ranch from going under, and a woman in this house means the bank stops asking questions about a man living alone with nothing but debt and grief to keep him company. That's the truth of it. I'm sorry if it ain't the truth you wanted." Josephine had faced rejection before. She had spent a lifetime learning the particular cruelty of men who looked at her and decided before she'd said a single word exactly how much of her opinion mattered. But this was a different cruelty. This was a man who had looked at her honestly and told her she was here to guard a grave, not build a life. She could have turned around. She could have walked back down that mile of road and found the next coach out of Stone Creek and never looked back. Instead, she picked her trunk up off the porch herself, since no one offered, and carried it through the door. "Where's the kitchen?" she asked. Wyatt blinked. "What?" "The kitchen, Mr. Marsh. If I'm to earn my keep in this arrangement of yours, I'd like to know where I'll be doing the earning." He stared at her a long moment, like he was trying to work out whether she was serious or simply too proud to admit defeat in front of him. Finally, he pointed down the hall. "Through there. Pantry's low. We've been eating whatever Mrs. Pruitt has time to throw together between chores." "Then I'll fix that tonight." She left him standing in the front room, beneath his dead wife's portrait. And if he was surprised by that, he didn't chase after her to say so. The kitchen told its own story. Empty shelves. A cold stove with ash still sitting in it from some meal days past. A single skillet, its bottom scorched black from being used and never properly cleaned. Josephine set her trunk in the corner, rolled up her sleeves, and started looking for what there was to work with. There wasn't much. Flour gone half to weevils, a little salt pork, some potatoes sprouting eyes in a crate. She'd cooked with less. She was elbow-deep in dough when Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "You've no business in this kitchen," Josephine said, not looking up. "Seems nobody's managed it in a while." "I manage it fine. There's ash in the stove 3 days cold, and a skillet that hasn't been scrubbed since Christmas, Mrs. Pruitt. I don't say that to shame you. I say it because I intend to help whether anyone in this house wants my help or not." Mrs. Pruitt's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Marsh doesn't need a woman coming in here trying to prove something." "I'm not trying to prove anything." Josephine finally looked up, flour-dusted across her knuckles. "I'm trying to make supper. There's a considerable difference." The older woman held her gaze a moment longer, searching for the fight she expected to find and not finding it. Something in her shoulders eased just slightly, though her voice stayed sharp. "Anna used to make the biscuits." "Then I imagine they were good ones." They were. Mrs. Pruitt's eyes drifted unfocused toward the window, toward some memory Josephine wasn't part of and never would be. "This ranch hasn't smelled like fresh bread in 3 years. Well?" Josephine punched the dough down, folded. It punched it again. "It's going to smell like it tonight." By the time the biscuits came out of the oven, the light outside had turned the color of a bruised purple gold, and fading fast, and the smell of hot bread and fried pork had crept into every corner of that quiet house. Josephine heard boots on the porch steps, heavy and slow, the sound of a man who worked from can't see to can't see, and felt every hour of it in his back. Wyatt stopped in the kitchen doorway like he'd walked into the wrong house. "That smell," he said. "Supper, Mr. Marsh?" She set a plate down at the head of the table, then another beside it, close enough that he'd have to decide whether to sit near her or make a point of not sitting near her. "It won't win any prizes, but it'll fill a belly." He sat. He didn't say thank you, not in words, but Josephine watched him eat 2 biscuits before he'd said a single sentence, and watched his shoulders drop an inch from where they'd been sitting up near his ears since she'd stepped off that stagecoach. "You didn't have to do this," he said finally. "No, I didn't." "Why'd you then?" Josephine considered the question longer than it probably deserved. "Because I came here to be your wife, Mr. Marsh, whatever that ends up meaning to you. And a wife feeds her household. That's not me trying to earn anything from you. That's just who I am." He chewed slowly, watching her over the rim of his coffee cup, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was something in his gray eyes that wasn't grief and wasn't guilt. It was closer to curiosity. Closer to a man realizing he might have misjudged the size of the thing standing in front of him. "Folks in town will talk," he said. "About you, about us. Ranchers around here, they've got opinions about a man who sends off for a bride through the mail. And they've got opinions about—" He stopped himself. "About a woman my size." Josephine said it plainly so he wouldn't have to work up the courage to. "You can say it, Mr. Marsh. I've heard worse than whatever this town's got waiting for me. I wasn't going to say it unkindly." "I know. That's why I said it for you." He looked down at his plate jaw, working like he was chewing on more than biscuits. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you cook better than anybody's cooked in this house in 3 years." It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't even close to warm. But it was the first true thing he'd said to her since she'd arrived that didn't sound like a rule or a warning, and Josephine found herself sitting up a little straighter in her chair because of it. The trouble arrived 2 days later, riding a black gelding, worth more than most men in Stone Creek would earn in a year. Josephine was hanging wash on the line when she heard the hooves, and she turned to see a man dismounting at the gate, like he owned it, tall, silver-templed, dressed in a coat too fine for a working ranch, a smile on his face that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "You must be the new Mrs. Marsh," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Gideon Ashford. I own the land east of here, and half the paper this ranch is standing on if Wyatt's been honest with you about his finances." His eyes moved over her slow and deliberate, the same measuring look Mrs. Pruitt had given her on the porch, except colder, meaner, dressed up in manners. "Though I confess I expected someone different." Different how Mr. Ashford. Wyatt Marsh could have had his pick of women in this territory once. Handsome man, good land before the debts piled up. He smiled wider. I suppose desperate times call for desperate arrangements. Josephine set down the shirt she'd been pinning, folded her hands in front of her apron, and looked him dead in the eye. Desperate Mr. Ashford is a man who has to insult a stranger's appearance to feel tall in his own boots. I hope that isn't your particular affliction, because it's a poor way to greet your neighbor's wife. His smile flickered just for a second before he rebuilt it. Sharp tongue. Well, I hope Wyatt appreciates it, because he's going to need every ounce of help he can get. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper, holding it just out of her reach, like a man dangling a treat in front of a dog. Tell your husband his note comes due in 6 weeks. Tell him I'd hate to see this ranch change hands over something as simple as arithmetic. I'll tell him you stopped by. Do that. Ashford swung back up onto his horse, gathering the reins. And Mrs. Marsh, welcome to Stone Creek. I do hope you last longer than the last one. Josephine felt the words land like a slap, but she didn't let her face show it. She stood in that yard with wet laundry dripping onto her boots and watched him ride away, and it was only once he was well out of sight that her hands finally started to shake. She didn't tell Wyatt what Ashford had said about lasting longer than the last one. Some cruelties weren't worth repeating, but she did tell him about the note and about the 6 weeks, and she watched the color drain slow and steady out of his face as she spoke. 6 weeks, he repeated. That's what he said. Wyatt sat down hard at the kitchen table, dragging both hands down over his face. I knew it was coming. I just thought I had more time to figure a way through it. How much do you owe him? More than this ranch is worth on paper, and every bit of what it's worth to me in the ground. He laughed short and bitter a sound with no humor in it at all. Anna's father borrowed against the north pasture 2 winters before she passed. Bad harvest, worse luck. I've been paying on that note ever since, and Ashford's held it quiet for 2 years, letting the interest pile up like snow before an avalanche. I always figured he was waiting on something. Waiting on what? Waiting on me to be too tired or too broke or too alone to fight him on it. Wyatt looked up at her, and there was something raw in his face that hadn't been there before. Not the careful, guarded grief he wore like armor, but real fear, plain and unhidden. I think that's part of why I wrote for a bride, if I'm honest. Man alone looks weak to a bank. Man alone looks weak to a wolf like Ashford. I needed this ranch to look like it had a future. I just didn't stop to think what that meant for the woman I was asking to come play the part. I'm not playing a part, Mr. Marsh. No. He studied her for a long moment. The lamplight caught the gray in his eyes and turned it almost silver. I don't suppose you are. Josephine sat down across from him, and without asking permission, she reached for the ledger book sitting at his elbow, the one he'd been staring at unopened for the better part of an hour. May I? He hesitated, then slid it toward her. You can read figures. I kept the books for my father's dry goods store in Independence for 6 years before he passed. I know my way around a column of numbers better than most bankers do. She flipped through the pages, her frown deepening with every entry. Mr. Marsh, this isn't just a note coming due. This is 3 separate debts, and unless I'm reading this wrong, someone's been charging you twice for feed deliveries that never arrived. Wyatt sat up straighter. Ashford's man handles our feed contracts. Then Ashford's man is either careless or he's stealing from you, and I'd wager it isn't carelessness. Josephine looked up from the ledger, and something had shifted in her face, the careful politeness of a stranger giving way to something sharper, steadier. You didn't just send for a wife, Mr. Marsh. Whether you meant to or not, you sent for someone who knows exactly how a man like Gideon Ashford operates. I've seen his kind before. They don't win by being stronger. They win because nobody bothers to check their arithmetic. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, Wyatt Marsh looked at her the way she'd hoped. Deep down, a man might look at her someday, not with pity and not with grief clouding every corner of his eyes, but with something that looked almost like hope. You'd help me fight this. I didn't travel 600 miles to watch a man lose everything to a bully in a fine coat, Josephine said. Whatever else this arrangement of ours turns out to be, Mr. Marsh, I don't lose easy. And neither, I think, should you. Outside, the wind picked up over the north pasture, rattling the on a chair nobody was allowed to touch. And somewhere out past the tree line on land, he didn't yet know he was about to lose piece by piece, Gideon Ashford was already drawing up the papers that would try to take it all. Josephine didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burned down low and the ledger open in front of her, tracing the same 3 columns of figures over and over until the numbers stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a confession. Wyatt sat across from her elbows on the table, watching her work the way a man watches weather come in over a ridge, knowing it's going to change everything and powerless to stop it from arriving. "You're certain," he said for the 3rd time. "I'm certain." She turned the ledger around so he could see it himself, tapping a finger against a line of cramped handwriting. Feed delivery, March the 4th, $40. Feed delivery, March the 11th, $40. Mr. Marsh, a ranch your size doesn't need 2 feed deliveries inside a week unless somebody's herd doubled overnight. Maybe the first one didn't come. Then why's it marked received and signed? She flipped back a page, then another, laying them side by side like a hand of cards. Nobody wanted to be dealt. Signed by the same man both times, R. Coulter. Same hand, same ink near enough. Either Mr. Coulter delivered feed twice in a week, your cattle never saw, or somebody's writing his name for him. Wyatt rubbed a hand across his jaw, and in the lamplight, Josephine could see just how tired he truly was. Not the ordinary tired of a man who'd worked a long day, but the deeper tired of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for so long, he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like without the weight. "Coulter works Ashford's spread," he said slowly. "Has for years." "Then I'd wager Mr. Coulter isn't stealing from you on his own account, Mr. Marsh. I'd wager he's stealing from you because somebody told him to, and somebody's been pocketing the difference every single month for longer than you've noticed. You're saying Ashford's been robbing me. Slow, on paper, where I'd never think to look. I'm saying a man who wanted your land wouldn't need to burn your barn down to get it," Josephine said quietly. "He'd just need to make sure you were bleeding a little every month quiet enough that you'd never catch it until the day came he could call the note, and you wouldn't have 2 nickels to rub together to fight him." Wyatt was quiet a long moment. Then he pushed back from the table so hard the chair legs screeched against the floor, and he stood there with his hands braced against the table's edge, breathing like a man who'd just been told the ground under his feet wasn't ground at all. 3 years, he said. 3 years, I've been telling myself I was just unlucky. Bad harvests, bad prices, bad everything. And the whole time somebody's been helping your luck along." Josephine closed the ledger gently. "I can't prove it yet. Not enough to stand up in front of a judge and make it stick. But I can prove it, Mr. Marsh, if you'll let me try." He looked at her across the table, really looked the way he hadn't quite managed to since she'd stepped off that stagecoach with her trunk and her tired arms and her plain, unbothered honesty. "Why would you do that? This ain't your fight." "You made it my fight the day you sent for me," Josephine said. "Or did you forget already, Mr. Marsh, that I'm supposed to be your wife?" Something crossed his face then. Not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one that Josephine felt her pulse skip in a way she hadn't given it permission to do. "No," he said. "I ain't forgot." Morning brought Mrs. Pruitt into the kitchen before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and Josephine was already elbow-deep in a fresh batch of dough when the older woman stopped short in the doorway, taking in the sight of her. "You've been up all night," Mrs. Pruitt said. It wasn't a question. "Most of it." "Doing what?" "Reading." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes narrowed, but there was less venom in the look than there'd been 2 days prior. Something closer to grudging curiosity had crept in where the suspicion used to live alone. "Mr. Marsh doesn't share his books with just anybody." "He didn't share them with me either, Mrs. Pruitt. I asked." "Nobody asks Mr. Marsh anything. Man barely talks. Hasn't since—" She stopped herself the way she always seemed to stop herself, right at the edge of Anna's name, like the word itself might crack something in the room that couldn't be put back together. Since his wife passed, Josephine finished for her gently. Mrs. Pruitt's chin lifted defensive. You don't know the first thing about that. You're right, I don't. Josephine kept her voice even and unhurried. But I know grief when I see it wearing a man's boots around a ranch he built with his own 2 hands, Mrs. Pruitt, and I know it isn't my place to ask him to set it down before he's ready. I only mean to help him carry the parts he'll let me carry. The older woman said nothing for a long moment, then quiet, almost reluctant. Anna used to say the same thing, about carrying. Said a marriage wasn't 2 people standing side by side doing the same work. Said it was 2 people trading off who carries the heavy end depending on the day. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Mrs. Pruitt's throat worked. She'd have liked you, I think, though she'd never have admitted it easy. Anna didn't trust folks quick. Took her the better part of a year to warm to me, and I was only the housekeeper. Well, Josephine said, setting the dough aside to rise. I've got time. I'm not going anywhere, Mrs. Pruitt. That's what the last one said, too. The words dropped into the kitchen like a stone into still water, and Josephine felt every ripple of it, though she kept her hand steady and her face carefully unbothered. The last one, Mrs. Pruitt's face went pale like she'd let slip something she'd meant to keep locked away. Never you mind. Forget I said it. Mrs. Pruitt? Josephine set down the towel she'd been wiping her hands on, and this time her voice had an edge to it, quiet but unmistakable. There was another woman before me. Wasn't there? Another bride Mr. Marsh sent for. The older woman's mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line, and for a moment, Josephine thought she might refuse to answer at all. Then finally low. There was a woman come through here last autumn. Widow from Ohio, answered the same kind of letter you did. Stayed less than a month. What happened to her? Ashford happened to her, Mrs. Pruitt said, and there was something bitter and old in the way she said his name, like a wound that had scarred over crooked. Same as he's happening to you now, I expect, if you don't watch yourself close. He came around, sweet as honey, told her all manner of things about Mr. Marsh being cursed, about this ranch being no place for a decent woman, about how Anna's ghost still walked these halls, looking for the wife who'd replaced her. Scared her clean off. She left on the next coach out, and never sent word again. Josephine felt something cold settle low in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. And Mr. Marsh let her go. Didn't try to stop her. Mr. Marsh doesn't beg women to stay, Mrs. Callahan. Never has. He figures if a person wants gone bad enough to listen to a man like Ashford over their own eyes, then gone is where they belong. Mrs. Pruitt studied her, something almost like warning in her stare. So, you'd best decide now, before you get any further attached to this place, whether you're the kind of woman Ashford can talk out the door, or whether you've got sand enough to stay when he comes calling again. Because he will come calling again. Man like that doesn't quit after one visit. I'm not leaving, Mrs. Pruitt. We'll see. She didn't have to wait long to be tested. 3 days later, Wyatt hitched the wagon for a supply run into Stone Creek, and Josephine climbed up onto the bench beside him before he could think to suggest she stay behind. He didn't argue. He only handed her the reins to hold while he checked the harness one final time, and something about the simple, wordless trust of it settled warm in her chest. The town unfolded slow around them as they rolled in a dusty main street lined with a general store, a livery, a saloon with its doors propped open against the morning heat, a church steeple standing white and proud against the blue Colorado sky. Folks stopped what they were doing to watch the wagon pass, and Josephine felt every one of those stares land on her like small stones. Don't mind them, Wyatt said low, not looking at her. I don't. You're gripping that rein strap awful tight for someone who doesn't mind. Josephine loosened her hands, forced her shoulders down from where they'd crept up near her ears. Old habit. They pulled up outside the general store, and Wyatt had barely set the brake before a cluster of women on the boardwalk went quiet all at once, the particular quiet of people who'd been talking about you and didn't want you to know it. Mrs. Marsh, one of them said, stepping forward with a smile that didn't sit right on her face. She was thin as a fence post, dressed sharp for a Tuesday morning, and her eyes moved over Josephine with the same slow cataloging cruelty Josephine had come to recognize. "I'm Loretta Ashford, Gideon's wife." Josephine kept her spine straight and her hand extended. "Josephine Callahan, pleasure." Loretta's grip was cool and brief over almost before it started. "We were just saying how surprised we all were when we heard Wyatt had sent all the way to Kansas for a bride." Her smile sharpened at the edges. "Word was, he wanted someone who could handle hard work. I suppose you'll manage that just fine." The women around her tittered soft and cruel, and Josephine felt the heat climb up her neck, even as she kept her face perfectly still. "I manage most things I set my mind to, Mrs. Ashford," Josephine said evenly. "Cooking, cleaning, keeping books, and I expect I'll manage a little gossip on a Tuesday morning without much trouble either." The tittering stopped. Loretta's smile faltered just barely before she recovered it. "Well, aren't you sharp-tongued?" She glanced past Josephine's shoulder to where Wyatt stood unloading crates from the wagon bed, close enough to have heard every word. "Wyatt, dear, you didn't tell us your new wife had such spirit." "I didn't think it was any of your business, Loretta," Wyatt said, not even looking up from his crates. The women exchanged glances, and one by one they drifted off down the boardwalk, leaving Loretta standing alone, with her thin smile cracking at the seams. "You'll want to be careful," she said to Josephine, quiet now, all the performance gone out of her voice. "Gideon doesn't forgive easy, and he's decided Wyatt Marsh is going to lose that ranch one way or another. Whether you're standing on it when it happens is entirely up to you." She turned and walked off before Josephine could answer, and Josephine stood there a moment on the boardwalk, hands curled into fists at her sides, watching her go. "You all right?" Wyatt asked, coming up beside her with a crate balanced on one hip. "I'm fine." She took a slow breath, unclenched her hands. "Your neighbor's wife just as good as told me her husband intends to ruin you, and she seemed almost sorry about it." "Loretta ain't a bad sort," Wyatt said. "Married to one, though. Married to a man who'd sell his own mother's grave marker if the price was right." He set the crate in the wagon bed harder than necessary. "Come on. Let's finish up and get home. This town's got enough opinions about us for one day." They were nearly done loading when a thin, sun-weathered man in a battered hat came shuffling out of the livery, glanced around like he was checking who might be watching, and sidled up close to the wagon. "Mr. Marsh," he said, voice pitched low. "Word a minute. Coulter." Wyatt's whole body went still. "Didn't expect to see you in town today." Josephine's ears pricked at the name. This was the man from the ledger, the signature on the feed deliveries. Ray Coulter shifted his weight from boot to boot, wringing his hat between his hands. "I heard you've been asking round about them feed deliveries from back in the spring." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Word travels fast." "It does when Ashford's got ears in every store on this street." Coulter glanced over his shoulder again, and Josephine could see the man's hands were shaking just slightly. "I ain't got long, but I wanted you to know I never meant no harm by it. Ashford, he told me it was just paperwork. Said the bank required extra deliveries logged for some kind of loan business. Said it wouldn't cost you nothing, real that it was just numbers on a page." His voice cracked. "I didn't know he was skimming off you till it was already done twice over. And by then I was scared to say different on account of what happened to the last fella who crossed Ashford." "What happened to him?" Josephine asked. Coulter's eyes flicked to her wary. "Lost his lease. Lost his cattle. Had to leave the territory inside a month. Ashford's got friends in the land office, ma'am. Friends that make problems for folks who make trouble for him." "Ray." Wyatt's voice had gone low and careful, the voice of a man handling something fragile. "Would you swear to what you just told me, in front of a judge if it came to that?" Coulter's face went the color of old paper. "I got a wife. Got young'uns. I can't afford to lose what little I got left to a fight that ain't mine." "Then why tell us at all?" Josephine asked gently. The man's throat worked, and for a moment, something like shame passed over his weathered features. Because Anna Marsh gave my boy medicine out of her own kitchen the winter he had the fever and never asked for a dime, and I've carried the shame of what I'd done to her husband's books ever since I understood what it was I was really signing." He jammed his hat back onto his head. "I can't swear nothing in front of no judge, but I kept a copy, private ledger. Every delivery I was told to log, that never happened. I've been keeping it since the second time case I ever needed proof I wasn't the only one at fault." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small worn notebook, pressing it into Wyatt's hands before he could think better of it. "Don't tell nobody where you got it. Please." Ray. But Coulter was already backing away. Hat pulled low, disappearing around the corner of the livery like a man trying to outrun his own conscience. Wyatt stood there in the street, the little notebook clutched tight in one hand, and when he looked over at Josephine, there was something fierce and disbelieving in his eyes. "This could be it," he said. "This could be exactly what we need." "Then let's get it home before anybody sees you holding it," Josephine said, already climbing up onto the wagon bench. "We can go through every page tonight." Tug. They read by lamplight until well past midnight. The little notebook spread open between them on the kitchen table, and every page confirmed what Josephine had already suspected. A pattern of falsified deliveries, stretching back nearly 2 years, small enough, each time to escape easy notice. Large enough in total to have quietly drained Wyatt's ranch of more money than the note itself was worth. "He's been stealing from me for 2 years, Wyatt said, staring at the numbers like they might rearrange themselves into something less damning if he looked hard enough. "And I never once thought to check. Just figured I was cursed. Figured bad luck was just what I got, same as I got Anna dying, and the drought the year after, and every other thing that's gone wrong since. It wasn't luck, Mr. Marsh." Josephine reached across the table, and without quite deciding to do it, laid her hand over his. "It was a man who decided you were an easy target because you were grieving and alone, and grieving lonely men don't have the energy to count their feed sacks." Wyatt looked down at her hand on his, and he didn't pull away. "You keep calling me Mr. Marsh," he said quietly. "Even after everything. Even sitting here at midnight going through stolen ledgers together like we're something." "What would you have me call you?" "Wyatt?" His voice had gone rough. "Just Wyatt. Seems foolish to keep standing on ceremony with a woman who's about to help me take down the man who's been robbing me blind." Something warm bloomed in Josephine's chest, unfamiliar, and a little frightening in how much she wanted to hold on to it. "Wyatt, then." He turned his hand over under hers, so that for a moment they were properly holding hands across a table covered in evidence of theft and grief, and 2 years of quiet suffering, and neither of them moved to pull away. "Josephine." He said her name slow, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth for the first time. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For the first day. For telling you this wasn't your home. For making you feel like you were here to guard a grave instead of build a life." His thumb moved just slightly against the back of her hand. "I was wrong. About a lot of things, I'm starting to think." Josephine's breath caught, and for a long suspended moment, the kitchen was silent except for the low hiss of the lamp and the sound of 2 people sitting very still, afraid to disturb something fragile and new. Then from the hallway a floorboard creaked and they broke apart like guilty children, and Mrs. Pruitt stood in the doorway in her nightclothes, arms crossed, an expression on her face that Josephine couldn't quite read. "It's near 1 in the morning, Mrs. Pruitt said. "Both of you ought to be asleep." "We found something, Mrs. Pruitt," Wyatt said, and for the first time since Josephine had arrived, there was real hope in his voice. "Proof. Real proof that Ashford's been stealing from this ranch." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes moved from the notebook to Wyatt's face to Josephine's, and something in her hard expression finally quietly cracked. "Well," she said after a long moment, "about time somebody caught that snake at his own game." She turned to go, then paused in the doorway, looking back at Josephine with something that might, in the right light, have almost passed for respect. "Anna would have liked you, Mrs. Callahan. I said it before, and I'll say it again plainer this time. She'd have liked you a great deal." The next morning brought trouble before the coffee had even finished boiling. Josephine woke to shouting outside Wyatt's voice, sharp and furious, carrying clear across the yard. She went to the porch to find him standing at the edge of the north pasture, staring at a stretch of fence that had been cut clean through in 3 separate places, wire coiled uselessly in the grass, and beyond it, the pasture stood empty. "They're gone," Wyatt said when she reached him, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Near 40 head. Whole north herd scattered to God knows where." "Cut fence doesn't cut itself," Josephine said, already moving toward the barn. "Where are you going?" "To saddle a horse, Mr. Wyatt." She caught herself, corrected herself, kept moving. 40 head of cattle don't just vanish into thin air. They scatter. And scattered cattle can be found if 2 people go looking instead of 1 man standing here cursing the fence that's already cut. Wyatt stared at her for half a second, something like disbelief and something like awe crossing his face in quick succession, and then he was moving too, grabbing tack off the wall, throwing a saddle over the gelding's back, with hands that shook with barely restrained rage. "You can ride. I can ride Wyatt Marsh. I can also read a ledger, bake a biscuit, and apparently now hunt cattle before breakfast. Is there anything else about me you're doubting this morning? Or should we get moving before that herd scatters clean into the next county?" Something that might on a different morning have been a laugh cracked across his tired, furious face. "No, ma'am. Reckon that about covers it." They found the cattle scattered across 3 miles of broken country, spooked and skittish, and it took them the better part of the day, working in tandem. Wyatt driving from the flank, while Josephine circled wide to turn the strays. Her skirts hiked and tied with a length of rope she'd found in the saddlebag. Riding harder than she had in years, her body aching in ways she'd forgotten it could ache alive with purpose in a way that felt almost like joy despite the circumstances. By the time the last stray was pushed back through the mended gap in the fence, the sun was low and red on the horizon, and both of them were coated head to boot in dust and sweat, and the particular satisfaction of a hard job finished together. "You did good today," Wyatt said, swinging down off his horse, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We did good today." Josephine slid down off her own mount legs, trembling with the effort of holding on for 8 straight hours, and Wyatt was there before she'd finished the thought, one hand steadying her elbow closer than he'd ever stood to her before. "Careful," he said low. "I'm fine. You're shaking. So are you." They stood there a moment too long, close enough that Josephine could see the dust settled in the lines around his eyes, close enough to feel the heat coming off him after a full day in the saddle. And for one wild, suspended second, she thought he might close that last small distance between them. Then a rider appeared at the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the dying light, and the moment shattered like glass. Gideon Ashford sat his horse at the crest of the hill, watching them unhurried like a man who'd been watching for some time already. "Evening, Marsh," he called down, his voice carrying easy across the quiet. "Seems you had some trouble with your fence today." "Seems I did," Wyatt called back, and Josephine could feel the fury coiling tight in the arm still braced against her own. Terrible thing, fence wire. Rusts clean through sometimes without a body even noticing. Ashford's smile was visible even at that distance, a pale slash in the dusk. "You ought to have it inspected regular. Man in your position can't afford to lose more head of cattle than he already has." "Funny thing about rust, Ashford," Josephine called out before Wyatt could speak, her voice ringing clear and steady across the pasture. "It doesn't usually cut in 3 straight lines." The smile on Ashford's face flickered just for a moment before he gathered his reins and turned his horse back toward the ridgeline. "You'd best keep that sharp tongue of yours in check, Mrs. Marsh," he called back, already riding away. "Sharp tongues have a way of cutting the woman holding them in the end." He was gone over the ridge before either of them could answer, and the 2 of them stood alone in the gathering dark, the mended fence at their backs, 40 head of cattle safely penned, and something new and dangerous now hanging in the air between them. "He cut that fence himself," Wyatt said, quiet and cold. "Or had it done, just to see what we'd do, just to remind us he's watching." "Then let him watch," Josephine said. "Let him see exactly what kind of trouble he's picked a fight with."
Hatate.
That night, after Mrs. Pruitt had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, Wyatt found Josephine on the porch, sitting in the very chair Mrs. Pruitt had once warned her never to touch Anna's chair. The pale blue shawl still folded on the seat beside her, though Josephine had been careful not to disturb it, only to sit near it, watching the stars come out over the dark shape of the mountains. "You're sitting in her chair," Wyatt said, but there was no anger in it, only a kind of tired wonder. "I can move." "No." He came and sat on the porch step below her, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed her knee. "Stay." They sat in silence a long moment, the night settling cool and quiet around them, crickets singing somewhere out past the barn. "Tell me about her," Josephine said finally. "About Anna, if you want to. I won't ask again if you don't." Wyatt was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then slow, like each word cost him something. "She was small. Smaller than you by half, quick-tempered, quicker to laugh. Used to say I worked too hard and loved too careful, like I was afraid loving something meant I'd have to answer for losing it someday." His voice caught. "Turned out she was right to worry. Just not about the loving part." "The fever took her fast," Mrs. Pruitt said. 6 days. Started as nothing. A cough, a little fever. By the 4th day she couldn't hardly speak. By the 6th—" He stopped, dragged a hand down over his face. "I held her hand the whole night. Told her every fool thing I could think to say. And in the morning, she was just gone. And I've been standing in this house ever since, surrounded by all her things, telling myself if I just kept it all exactly the way she left it, some part of her would still be here, still be waiting." "Is she?" Josephine asked gently. "Still here." Wyatt looked up at her, and in the moonlight his gray eyes were wet. "No," he said, and it sounded like the truest thing he'd said since she'd arrived. "She ain't. Hasn't been for a long while. I think I just wasn't ready to admit that till somebody walked into this house and made it feel alive again." Josephine's throat tightened, and she reached down slow, giving him every chance to pull away, and laid her hand against the side of his face. He didn't pull away. He leaned into it instead, like a man who'd been cold a long, long time, finally finding warmth. "I'm not trying to replace her, Wyatt. I know that." His hand came up, covering hers, holding it there against his cheek. "I know that now. Ashford wants me gone, same as he wanted the last woman gone. I know that too." His jaw tightened under her palm. "And I ain't letting it happen. Not this time." "You couldn't have stopped it with her, the other woman." "Maybe not, but I didn't try either. Just let her walk out to that coach, and told myself it was for the best, told myself I wasn't ready anyhow." He turned his face, pressed a kiss, brief and warm, into the center of her palm, and Josephine felt the whole world narrow down to that single point of contact. "I'm not making that mistake twice, Josephine Callahan. Whatever Ashford throws at us next, we face it together, or we don't face it at all." They didn't have long to wait to find out what next would look like. 3 days later, a rider came pounding up the road at a dead gallop, and Josephine's heart lurched into her throat before she even recognized the boy, young Tommy Halloran, who ran errands for the bank in town, his face white as milk. "Mr. Marsh?" the boy shouted, hauling his horse up so hard it reared. "Mr. Marsh, you gotta come quick." "The bank. Mr. Ashford's filed papers, says you're in default on the note. Says he's calling the whole thing due tomorrow, not in 6 weeks like he told you before. Says the bank's set to seize the ranch first thing Friday morning." The world seemed to tilt beneath Josephine's feet. "That's not possible," Wyatt said, striding forward, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "He said 6 weeks. He gave his word." "I don't know nothing about words, Mr. Marsh. I just know what the papers say, and the papers say Friday." The boy's horse danced nervous beneath him. "My pa's the one filing them at the courthouse. Said Mr. Ashford found some clause, some old paper Anna's father signed. Says the note can be called early if the borrower's, The boy swallowed clearly, repeating words he didn't fully understand. "If the borrower's circumstances are judged unstable." On account of you marrying so sudden, and all the talk in town. Josephine felt her stomach drop clean through the porch boards. He's using our marriage against us, she said slowly. He's telling the bank that marrying me sending for unreliable. He's using the very thing he mocked me for at the gate to try and take your home. Friday, Wyatt said, his voice hollow. That's 2 days. 2 days to prove a 2-year pattern of theft, save your home, and stop a man with friends in every land office in the territory. Josephine's mind was already racing, already sorting through everything they had. Coulter's notebook, the falsified ledgers, the cut fence, Loretta's warning on the boardwalk. It's not enough time, Wyatt. Not through the usual channels. Then what channels are left? Josephine looked out across the yard toward the road that led into Stone Creek toward the courthouse and the bank, and the judge who'd sign away everything Wyatt Marsh had ever built with his own 2 hands, and something hard and determined settled into her spine. We stop playing by his rules, she said. We stop waiting to be believed, and we make it so nobody in that town can look away from the truth, even if they wanted to. How? I don't know yet. Josephine turned to face him fully, and despite the fear coiled tight in her chest, her voice came out steady, unshaking. But I know a man like Ashford has spent years building a reputation as an honest, respected businessman in that town. And reputations built on lies have a way of collapsing awful fast once the right people see the truth laid out plain in front of them. Wyatt looked at her. Really. Looked at her the way he had that first day on the porch, except now there was no grief clouding it, no resignation, only something fierce and grateful and half disbelieving. You'd really fight this. With me. All the way to the end. I told you already, Wyatt Marsh. Josephine took his hand, held it tight between both of hers, steady, even as the whole world seemed to be tilting toward disaster. I don't lose easy, and neither do you. We've got 2 days. Let's make them count. Behind them on the porch, the pale blue shawl stirred faintly in the evening wind, and out past the ridgeline, in a fine house built on borrowed land and stolen money. Gideon Ashford sat down at his desk, poured himself a drink, and smiled at the thought of Friday morning, entirely unaware that the woman he'd underestimated at the gate had already begun building the case that would end him. They worked through the night by lamplight, the kitchen table buried under ledgers and Coulter's notebook, and every scrap of paper Wyatt had saved over 3 years without ever understanding what he was saving them for. We need more than numbers, Josephine said, rubbing her eyes, the words starting to blur together on the page. Numbers convince a banker who wants to be convinced. They don't convince a judge who's likely already been bought. Then what convinces a bought judge? A town full of witnesses standing in the room when the truth gets said out loud. Josephine sat back staring at the notebook like it might yield one more secret if she looked hard enough. Ashford's whole plan depends on this happening quiet. Papers filed, note called ranch seized before anybody thinks to ask questions. He doesn't want to fight Wyatt. He wants a formality. So we make it not a formality. We make it impossible for anybody in that courthouse to look away. Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway, then wrapped in her shawl, her gray hair loose around her shoulders in a way Josephine had never seen it. She'd been listening evidently from somewhere down the hall. There's something you two don't know, she said. Both of them looked up. About the original note. Mrs. Pruitt continued, coming into the kitchen slow, like the words cost her something to say. The one Anna's father signed. I was in this house the day the bankman came out to have it witnessed. Wyatt straightened. You were there. I poured the coffee. Mrs. Pruitt's mouth twisted bitter. Anna's father was near blind by then, cataracts thick as milk glass. Could barely see his own hand in front of his face, let alone read a contract. The bankman read it to him quick, mumbled through the terms, and had him sign where he was told. She hesitated. But it wasn't the same bankman who came to collect on it later. It was Ashford's man. And when I saw the note again years after, the terms were different than what I remembered being read aloud that day. Josephine's pulse quickened. Different how? The interest. The call clause, the one letting Ashford demand payment early if he judged the borrower unstable. I don't recall any of that being read out loud the day it was signed. I recall talk of a fair rate and 10 years to pay. Mrs. Pruitt's hands twisted together in front of her. I always told myself I misremembered. Told myself an old woman's memory plays tricks. But sitting here listening to you two tonight, I don't think I misremembered anything at all. You'd swear to that, Josephine said, in front of the town. Mrs. Pruitt lifted her chin, and for the first time since Josephine had arrived, there was no suspicion left in the older woman's face at all, only a hard, clean resolve. I loved that girl like she was my own. I've kept this house exactly as she left it for 3 years because I couldn't bear to let go of the last thing she touched. But Anna Marsh did not believe in letting bullies win, and I have spent 3 years being a coward in her memory instead of honoring it. Her voice cracked, just slightly. Yes, I'll swear to it, in front of God and the whole of Stone Creek if that's what it takes. Wyatt reached out and gripped the older woman's hand, and for a moment, none of them said anything at all. The kitchen, thick with something that felt almost like grief, and almost like hope, tangled together too close to pull apart. That's a start, Josephine said finally, her voice thick. But an old note reread differently by a grieving housekeeper isn't proof enough on its own. We need the original document, the real one if it still exists, or something that shows it was altered. Ashford wouldn't destroy it, Wyatt said slowly, thinking out loud. Man like that doesn't burn evidence. He hoards it, keeps it close in case he ever needs to prove his own version of events. Where would he keep something like that? His study, ledger room off the back of the house. He's the sort who trusts nobody else to touch his papers, not even Loretta. Wyatt's jaw tightened. But I've got no right to walk into that house and go through his desk, Josephine. That's not proving fraud. That's committing it. No, Josephine agreed. But maybe somebody with a legitimate reason to be in that house might see something without needing to go looking for it at all. Wyatt frowned. Who? Josephine's mind was already turning it over, already remembering the tired, brittle woman on the boardwalk, the flicker of something almost like guilt in her eyes when she'd warned Josephine to be careful. His wife told me days ago that he doesn't forgive easy and that he'd decided to ruin you no matter what. She said it like she was sorry about it, Wyatt, like she didn't entirely agree with what her husband was doing. Loretta. Wyatt shook his head. She won't cross him. Nobody in this county crosses Gideon Ashford. Maybe nobody's ever given her a reason worth the risk. Josephine stood smoothing down her skirts, resolve settling cold and clear into her chest. I think it's time I paid a call on Mrs. Ashford. She rode out alone the next morning against Wyatt's protests because some conversations went easier, woman to woman without a husband's presence, changing the shape of what either side was willing to say. The Ashford house sat grand and cold at the top of a long drive, white columns and glass windows that caught the morning sun like something out of a picture book. And Josephine felt the wrongness of it the moment she climbed down from her horse. A house built too fine for the land around it, like a man had tried to buy his way into being respected instead of earning it. Loretta answered the door herself, and her face went through 3 expressions, in as many seconds: surprise, wariness, and finally something that looked almost like relief. Mrs. Marsh. She glanced past Josephine's shoulder toward the empty drive. You've come alone. I have. Gideon's in town. Won't be back till supper. Loretta's hand tightened on the doorframe. You shouldn't be here. I know. Josephine kept her voice gentle, unhurried. But I think you already know why I've come, Mrs. Ashford, and I think some part of you has been waiting for somebody to come ask. Loretta was quiet a long moment, her eyes flicking over Josephine's face like she was searching for a trap. Then finally she stepped back from the door. You'd best come in. Quickly. The inside of the house was as cold and formal as its face, polished floors. Heavy drapes, furniture that looked like it had never once been sat on for comfort. Loretta led her through to a small sitting room and closed the door behind them both, and only then did some of the careful stiffness go out of her shoulders. Whatever you're going to ask me, Loretta said, I want you to understand something first. I didn't marry a monster. I married an ambitious man 20 years ago, and I told myself ambition wasn't the same thing as cruelty. I've spent 20 years learning how wrong I was, and I've spent every one of those years too frightened, or too comfortable, or too something to do a single thing about it. I'm not here to judge your marriage, Mrs. Ashford. Loretta, if we're going to do whatever it is you came here to do, you might as well call me Loretta. She sat gesturing for Josephine to do the same, though her hands were trembling in her lap. You want to know about the note, Anna's father's note. Josephine's breath caught. You know about it. I know Gideon keeps a ledger room he thinks I've never set foot in. I know he keeps original documents locked in a strongbox under his desk, ones he's altered and ones he hasn't, so he always knows which version of the truth to tell which person. Loretta's voice had gone flat, exhausted, the voice of a woman finally setting down a weight she'd carried too long. I found the key 11 years ago quite by accident, and I have never once had the courage to use it for anything but satisfying my own curiosity. Until now. So, Loretta? Josephine leaned forward. If there's an original note in that strongbox, one that shows the terms were changed after Anna's father signed it, that could save Wyatt's entire ranch. It could stop Friday's seizure before it ever happens. I know what it could do. Loretta's eyes were wet bright with something that looked like 20 years of swallowed anger finally coming loose. It could also end my marriage, Mrs. Marsh. It could see me thrown out of this house with nothing but the clothes on my back, because Gideon Ashford does not forgive betrayal, and there is no betrayal he would consider greater than his own wife handing his enemies the rope to hang him with. I understand if you can't. I didn't say I can't. Loretta stood abruptly, crossing to the window, staring out at the manicured grounds like they belonged to somebody else's life. I watched that other woman leave last autumn, the one before you. I watched Gideon come home laughing about how easy it had been, how a few well-placed lies about ghosts and curses had sent a grown woman running for the next coach out of town. And I told myself that was simply how business was done in this territory, that I had no right to interfere in my husband's affairs. She turned back, and her face had hardened into something Josephine hadn't seen there before, resolve sharp and sudden, like a woman finally deciding which side of a line she meant to stand on. But you didn't run, Mrs. Marsh. You stood on that boardwalk, and you looked me dead in the eye, and you told me you weren't afraid of a little gossip. I've thought about that every day since. I am 46 years old, and I have never once in my whole life stood up the way you stood up to me without even knowing my name yet. Loretta, give me until tonight. Loretta said, her voice steadying resolve settling into her spine. Gideon rides out to check the North Claim most evenings before supper. I'll have an hour, maybe less. If the note's in that strongbox, I'll find it. And if he catches you. Loretta's jaw set, and for just a moment, Josephine saw the ghost of the woman she must have been 20 years earlier before ambition and fear had worn her down into something smaller. Then I suppose I'll finally find out whether I'm as much of a coward as I've spent 2 decades believing I am. Doug. Josephine rode home with her heart in her throat, and the waiting that followed was worse than any of it. Worse than the ledgers, worse than the cut fence, worse than the sound of Tommy Halloran's terrified voice shouting about papers filed at the courthouse. Wyatt paced the length of the porch until the boards themselves seemed to groan with the weight of his worry. Mrs. Pruitt sat in the kitchen with her rosary moving quiet through her fingers, though Josephine had never once seen her pray before that night. And Josephine herself sat on the porch steps in the very spot where Wyatt had told her about Anna 2 nights before, watching the road, waiting for a rider who might never come. It was nearly 9 o'clock, full dark, when hoofbeats finally sounded on the road, fast, urgent, a single horse ridden hard. Josephine was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move, and Wyatt was right behind her. Both of them at the gate as Loretta Ashford came thundering up the drive. Hatless, her hair come loose from its pins, a leather satchel clutched tight against her chest. "I have it!" she gasped, half falling from the saddle, and Wyatt caught her before she hit the ground. I have it, dear God! I thought he'd catch me. I thought—" Her voice broke, and for a moment she simply stood there, shaking, gripping the satchel, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "Loretta." Josephine took her by the shoulders. "Look at me. Are you hurt? Did he see you?" "No. No, I don't think so. I heard him come in the front while I was still in the study, and I climbed out the window like a girl half my age and rode straight here without even saddling proper. I just threw the blanket on and went—" She was laughing now, half hysterical, tears streaming down her face. 20 years, Mrs. Marsh. 20 years I let that man tell me what kind of woman I was allowed to be, and it took me 11 minutes tonight to decide I was done being her. Wyatt took the satchel gently from her shaking hands and carried it into the house, and by lamplight, with all four of them crowded around the kitchen table, he drew out the contents with hands that trembled worse than Loretta's had. The original note lay on top Anna's father's signature at the bottom, shaky and uncertain, exactly as Mrs. Pruitt had described a blind old man signing something he could not read. And the terms written in a different, tighter hand than the body of the document were exactly as Mrs. Pruitt remembered them: a fair rate a full decade, to pay no call clause anywhere in sight. Beneath it, a second document. The note, as it currently stood at the bank terms, altered the call clause added, in a hand that matched unmistakably samples of Gideon Ashford's own correspondence that Wyatt had received over the years. "He forged it," Wyatt breathed. "He took a dying old man's signature and built an entirely different debt on top of it." "There's more," Loretta said quietly, drawing a third paper from the satchel, her voice gone hollow. "I found this beneath the notes. I didn't understand it at first, but I think you should read it." Josephine took the paper, and as her eyes moved down the page, her stomach turned cold. It was a letter unsent, addressed to a land office in Denver, dated nearly 3 years back, shortly after Anna's death. In it, Gideon Ashford inquired in careful business-like language about the process for acquiring ranch land, whose owner had recently been widowed, specifically asking what conditions might allow a note to be called early on grounds of borrower instability following personal tragedy. "He planned this," Josephine said slowly, "before Anna was even cold in the ground. He wasn't waiting for an opportunity, Wyatt. He was building one." Wyatt's face had gone the color of ash, his hands braced flat against the table, like he needed something solid to hold on to. 3 years, he said hollow. 3 years he's been circling, waiting, planning exactly how he'd take everything from me, starting the very week I buried my wife. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The lamp hissed low. Outside, the wind moved through the north pasture, where 40 head of cattle grazed, safe behind a mended fence, unaware of how close they'd come to belonging to another man entirely. "Friday?" Josephine said, finally breaking the silence. "We have until Friday morning. That's not enough time to file a formal challenge through the courts, not with a judge Ashford's likely already got in his pocket." "Then what do we do with all this?" Wyatt asked. Josephine looked around the table at Wyatt, hollowed out with grief and fury in equal measure at Mrs. Pruitt, with her rosary still wound through her fingers at Loretta, who had risked everything she had in the space of 11 terrified minutes. "We stop asking permission to be believed," Josephine said. "Friday morning, when that seizure's set to happen, half this town will be at the courthouse or close enough to hear about it before noon. We don't wait for a private hearing where Ashford can smooth things over with a judge he already owns. We make sure the whole of Stone Creek hears the truth at the exact same moment, in the exact same breath, before anybody has a chance to bury it." Friday morning came gray and cold, an early frost silvering the grass, and Stone Creek's main street was already thick with wagons and horses and townsfolk, drawn by the particular hunger people carry for watching another family's ruin unfold in public. Josephine stood beside Wyatt on the courthouse steps, dressed in her plainest, sturdiest dress. The satchel of evidence held tight against her side, and she could feel every eye on that street settle onto her, measuring her same as always, same as that very first day on the porch. But this time, she found she didn't shrink from it. This time she stood taller because of it. Gideon Ashford arrived precisely at 9, dressed in his finest coat, flanked by a lawyer and a bank officer, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had already won. "Marsh," he said, tipping his hat with mocking courtesy. "Come to watch the paperwork get finalized, I see. Brave of you. Most men prefer to skip this particular ceremony." "We're not here to watch anything get finalized, Ashford," Wyatt said, his voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd. "We're here to stop it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ashford's smile didn't waver, though something flickered behind his eyes. "Is that so? And how do you propose to do that exactly?" "The note's in default. The terms are the terms, whatever sentimental objections you might have." "The terms," Josephine said, stepping forward, her voice ringing clear and steady in the cold morning air, "were forged, Mr. Ashford, and I have the proof right here if you'd care for the whole of Stone Creek to hear it read aloud." The crowd went dead silent. Ashford's smile finally slipped. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Marsh. I'd think carefully before making it in front of witnesses." "I have thought carefully. For 3 days and 3 nights, Mr. Ashford, I've thought of little else." Josephine drew the original note from the satchel and held it up high enough for the crowd to see, though not yet close enough for Ashford to reach. "This is the note Anna Marsh's father signed nearly blind and dying 4 years ago. Fair terms, 10 years to pay. No clause allowing early collection on grounds of, and I quote, borrower instability." "That paper means nothing," Ashford snapped, and for the first time real alarm had crept into his voice. "I don't know where you got it, but—" "I got it." Loretta Ashford's voice cut through the crowd, and every head turned as she stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the back. Her chin lifted her spine straight, despite the visible tremor running through her. "From your own strongbox, Gideon, where you keep the original documents beside the ones you altered, so you'd always remember which lie you'd told which man." The crowd erupted into murmurs, and Ashford's face went white, then red, his composure cracking wide open in front of the whole of Stone Creek. "Loretta." His voice had gone dangerously quiet. "You will regret this." "I've regretted a great deal in 20 years of marriage to you, Gideon," Loretta said, and her voice, though it shook, did not stop. "I don't intend to add this to the list." Josephine pressed forward before the moment could lose its momentum. "There's more, Mr. Ashford." A letter, written not long after Anna Marsh's death, inquiring how a man might acquire a widower's ranch on grounds of again instability following personal tragedy. She held it up. "You didn't wait for an opportunity to ruin Wyatt Marsh. You built one before his wife was 3 days in the ground." The murmur in the crowd had turned into something sharper now, something closer to outrage, and Josephine could see faces she recognized from that first day on the boardwalk. The women who'd tittered at her, the men who'd stared at her trunk with pity and doubt, and every one of them was looking now, not at her, but at Gideon Ashford, with an expression that had shifted unmistakably into something like disgust. "And Ray Coulter," Wyatt added, his voice hard as flint. "Your own hired man forced for 2 years to log feed deliveries that never happened, so you could skim the profits and starve this ranch slow enough that nobody would ever notice until it was too late to fight back." A voice rose up from the back of the crowd, thin and nervous, but steady. "It's true." Ray Coulter pushed his way forward, hat clutched in both hands, his face pale but resolute. "I got the notebook to prove it. Kept every entry myself. I'm done being scared of you, Mr. Ashford. I got a boy who's old enough now to ask me someday what kind of man his father was, and I don't aim to tell him I let a bully steal from a good man because I was too frightened to speak up." The bank officer standing beside Ashford had gone visibly pale, shuffling backward half a step, as though physically trying to distance himself from what was unfolding. "Mr. Ashford," he said quietly, "if these documents are what they appear to be, the bank cannot be party to." "They're forgeries," Ashford snapped, though the confidence had bled entirely out of his voice. "All of it. A grieving rancher's wife concocting stories to save a debt he can't pay, and a bitter housekeeper and a disloyal wife too foolish to know their place." "I would be careful, Mr. Ashford," said a new voice, older weathered, cutting through the crowd with unmistakable authority. Josephine turned to see an elderly man in a plain dark coat step forward. Silver-haired, sharp-eyed, leaning on a cane, but standing tall despite it. The crowd parted for him instinctively, and several people murmured his name with something close to reverence. "Judge Whitfield." Wyatt breathed. "I wasn't scheduled to be in Stone Creek till next week," the judge said, his gaze moving slow and deliberate over the assembled crowd. "But a friend of mine at the Territorial Land Office sent word 3 days back that some unusual inquiries had come through his desk regarding a certain widowed rancher's property. I decided to see for myself what all the fuss was about." His sharp eyes settled on Ashford, cold and assessing. "It appears I arrived just in time." Ashford's jaw worked, but no words came out. "I'll want to examine those documents personally," Judge Whitfield said, extending a weathered hand toward Josephine. "All of them. And I'll want sworn statements from every witness standing on these steps who has something to say about Mr. Ashford's business practices over these past several years." Josephine placed the satchel into the judge's outstretched hand, her own hands finally blessedly starting to shake now that the worst of it was said and done. "There will be a full accounting of this," the judge continued, his voice carrying easy across the silent street. "And Mr. Ashford, until that accounting is complete, I am ordering an immediate halt to any seizure proceedings against the Marsh Ranch pending investigation into these forgery allegations, which strike me on first inspection as considerably more than mere allegation." The crowd broke into a wave of murmuring, some shocked, some triumphant, and Josephine felt Wyatt's hand find hers, gripping tight, both of them still catching their breath from the sheer dizzying speed of everything that had just unfolded. Ashford's composure finally shattered entirely. He rounded on Josephine, his face twisted with fury. "You," he spat. "This is your doing. A fat mail-order nothing from Kansas thinking she could walk into my territory and—" "Gideon!" Loretta's voice cracked like a whip across the street, silencing him instantly, and the crowd's attention swung to her, stunned, into fresh silence. "That's enough. That has always been enough, and I was too much of a coward for 20 years to say so. This woman came to Stone Creek with nothing but a trunk and her own 2 hands, and inside of 2 weeks, she has done more good for this town than you've managed in 20 years of pretending to be respectable." Her chin lifted, tears bright in her eyes, but her voice unbroken. "I'm done pretending too." The crowd was dead silent, every eye fixed on the unraveling of a man who had for years walked through Stone Creek believing himself untouchable. "This isn't finished," Ashford said, low venomous backing toward his waiting horse. "Whitfield's an old fool who'll be gone from this territory in a week's time, and I'll still be here, Marsh. I'll still be here long after your little Kansas bride has grown tired of playing hero and gone running same as the last one." "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Ashford," Josephine said, and her voice did not waver, did not shake, rang clear and certain across the whole of that silent street. "I didn't travel 600 miles to be frightened off by a man whose entire fortune turns out to be built on forged paper and a dying old man's trust. Whatever's left of your reputation after today, you built it, stealing from grieving widowers and threatening frightened women into silence. That reputation is finished, whether Judge Whitfield's still in this territory next week or not, because this whole town just watched you unmasked with their own 2 eyes." Ashford stared at her a long, furious moment, and then finding nothing left to say, he swung up onto his horse and rode off down the street without another word. His lawyer and the pale-faced bank officer hurrying after him, leaving Loretta standing alone amid a crowd of neighbors who, for the first time in years, were looking at her with something other than distant politeness. The crowd didn't disperse quickly. People lingered on the courthouse steps talking in low, astonished clusters, and one by one they began to approach not Wyatt at first, but Josephine. An older woman Josephine recognized vaguely from the general store stepped forward first, her weathered hands wringing together. "Mrs. Marsh, I owe you an apology, I think. I said some unkind things about you the day you arrived. About your size, about you being some desperate arrangement for a desperate man." Her eyes were wet. "I was wrong. I hope you'll forgive an old woman's foolishness." "There's nothing to forgive," Josephine said gently. "You didn't know me yet." "No," the woman agreed. "None of us did." More followed, a rancher whose land bordered Ashford's, who'd suspected foul dealing for years, but never had the courage to say so aloud. A young mother who'd heard the whispers about the mail-order bride and repeated them without ever stopping to wonder if they were true. Even Loretta, standing a little apart from the crowd watching Josephine with an expression that mixed gratitude and something like awe. "What happens to you now?" Josephine asked her quietly, once the crowd had thinned enough for private words. Loretta's smile was tired, but real. "I don't know. I imagine my marriage is finished one way or another, whether Gideon admits it today or waits until the shame's worn thin enough to pretend otherwise. But I find strangely that I'm not frightened of that the way I thought I'd be." She reached out and squeezed Josephine's hand. "You gave me something today, Mrs. Marsh, that 20 years of comfortable silence never managed to give me. You gave me back my own spine." "You found it yourself, Loretta. I only asked the question." "Sometimes," Loretta said, "that's all a person needs. Somebody brave enough to ask." Judge Whitfield found them as the crowd finally began to disperse, his expression grave but not unkind. "I'll need several days to conduct a proper investigation," he said. "Documents to verify, statements to take formally, the bank's own records to examine against what you've shown me. But I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Marsh. Mrs. Marsh, what I've seen here today does not look good for Mr. Ashford. Not good at all." "What happens to the ranch in the meantime?" Wyatt asked. "The ranch stays exactly where it belongs. With you." The judge's sharp eyes moved between them, something almost approving in his weathered face. "I've seen a great many disputes in this territory over the years, Mr. Marsh. I don't believe I've ever seen one broken open quite so thoroughly or quite so fast." His gaze settled on Josephine. "You did good work, Mrs. Marsh. This territory needs more people willing to stand up and say the true thing out loud, whatever the cost of saying it." He tipped his hat and moved off through the thinning crowd, and Wyatt and Josephine were left standing together on the courthouse steps, the cold morning sun finally beginning to burn through the last of the frost, the whole weight of the past 3 days lifting off both their shoulders at once. "We did it," Wyatt said, like he couldn't quite believe the words as he said them. "We did it," Josephine agreed. He turned to face her fully then, and there was something in his gray eyes that hadn't been there that first day on the porch. No grief, no resignation, only something warm and certain and entirely new. "Josephine Callahan," he said low, just for her. "I sent for a stranger to help me keep this ranch standing. I never once imagined I'd end up owing her my whole life." "You don't owe me anything, Wyatt Marsh." "No," he agreed, reaching for her hand right there on the courthouse steps in front of half of Stone Creek. "I suppose I don't. I suppose what I feel for you isn't a debt at all." Behind them, the town of Stone Creek carried on with its morning changed in ways it would take weeks yet to fully understand. And somewhere down the road, in a fine house that no longer felt quite so untouchable, Gideon Ashford sat alone with the ruins of a reputation he'd spent 20 years building and understood for the first time that some debts could never be forged away. The investigation took 6 days, and every one of those 6 days Stone Creek buzzed like a hive somebody had kicked over. Josephine felt the shift before she understood it. The way women on the boardwalk who'd once looked past her now stopped to nod, the way the storekeeper set aside the good flour without being asked, the way children who'd stared at her that first week now waved when the wagon rolled past. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something closer to a town waking up and deciding to look at what had been standing in front of them the whole time. "You're famous," Wyatt told her, amused, as they drove home from another supply run, this one blessedly free of Loretta's sharp-tongued welcome or Ashford's cold smile. "Whole town's talking about the woman who caught Gideon Ashford with his own strongbox." "I didn't catch anything. Loretta did the catching." "Loretta wouldn't have gone near that strongbox if you hadn't ridden out and asked her to remember she had a spine." Wyatt flicked the reins easy and unhurried, and Josephine noticed, not for the first time, how much lighter he sat these days, shoulders down, jaw unclenched. A man who'd set something heavy down and hadn't quite gotten used to how it felt to walk without it. Coulter's boy told half the schoolyard his pa was a hero. Coulter about turned 3 shades of red when he heard. He is a hero. Took more courage for a scared man with a family to feed to speak up than it took me to ask a few pointed questions. Maybe. Wyatt glanced sideways at her, something warm and unguarded in his gray eyes. "I've been thinking a lot these past few days about courage." About how I spent 3 years telling myself I was surviving when really I was just standing still and calling it strength. Josephine's chest tightened, but she kept her voice light. And now, I think I finally understand the difference. He didn't say more than that, but he reached over and took her hand on the wagon bench right there in plain sight of anyone who cared to look, and Josephine let him. The trouble came, as trouble had a habit of doing in Ashford's orbit on the fifth night, quiet, almost gentle, the way a snake moves before it strikes. Josephine woke to the smell of smoke, not wood smoke from the stove banked low for morning. Something sharper, something wrong, and she was on her feet and out of bed before her mind had fully caught up with her body's instinct. "Wyatt!" She was already down the hall, pounding on his door. "Wyatt, wake up, something's burning." He came out half-dressed, boots in one hand, already moving. "Barn." He said the single word, grim as a gunshot, and then he was running, and Josephine was right behind him, her nightgown catching at her ankles as she flew across the yard. Flame licked orange and hungry along the base of the north wall of the barn, and inside Josephine could hear the panicked screaming of horses trapped against a wall of smoke. "The horses!" she shouted. "I know." Wyatt was already hauling the barn door wide, disappearing into the smoke without a moment's hesitation, and Josephine's heart lurched into her throat as she lost sight of him entirely. "Wyatt! Get buckets!" His voice came back, muffled, choking. "Pumps by the trough. Hurry!" Josephine didn't stop to think. She ran for the pump, hauling water in a bucket too heavy for her arms, and not caring. Throwing it against the base of the flame again and again, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming. While behind her, Mrs. Pruitt came stumbling out of the house in her nightclothes, screaming for the ranch hands who slept in the bunkhouse a quarter-mile off. Wyatt emerged from the smoke, leading 2 terrified horses, one after another, coughing so hard he could barely stand, and Josephine dropped her bucket and ran to him, catching him as his knees nearly buckled. "There's 2 more in there," he gasped. "You can't go back in, you can barely breathe. I'm not losing anything else to that man." His eyes, red-rimmed and fierce, met hers. "Not one more thing, Josephine. Not after everything." He went back in. Josephine screamed his name until her voice cracked, and it was the longest 30 seconds of her entire life before he emerged again, leading the last 2 horses, his shirt scorched black along one arm, his face streaked with soot and fury. By the time the bunkhouse hands arrived with more buckets, the flame had eaten a third of the barn's north wall, but the fire line held, and slowly, agonizingly, they beat it back into smoking ruin instead of total loss. Wyatt sank down onto the trampled grass afterward, chest heaving, and Josephine dropped beside him, her hands shaking as she checked the burn along his forearm. "This needs tending," she said, her voice unsteady. "It'll keep." He caught her hand, held it still against his arm. "Josephine." "What?" "Somebody set that fire deliberate. I could smell the coal oil clear as anything, soon as I got that door open." Cold dread settled deep in Josephine's stomach. Ashford. Who else? Wyatt's jaw was tight fury, burning brighter than any exhaustion. Judge Whitfield's investigations got him cornered, and a cornered man like Ashford doesn't just lay down and accept defeat quiet. He lashes out. He could have burned the house instead of the barn. Maybe he ain't ready to kill anybody yet. Wyatt's voice went hard and flat. Maybe he's just reminding us he can still hurt us, even with half the town turning against him. Maybe that's exactly the kind of message a man like Ashford sends when he's got nothing left to lose but his pride. Mrs. Pruitt appeared beside them, a lantern in one shaking hand, her face pale with fear and fury. "Both. I've sent one of the hands into town for the sheriff. This ain't going unanswered, not this time." "No," Josephine agreed, staring at the smoldering ruin of the barn's north wall, at the 4 horses still trembling and wide-eyed in the yard, at Wyatt's burned arm and soot-streaked face. "It isn't." Sheriff Daniel Bragg arrived within the hour, a broad, unhurried man with tired eyes, and a reputation, Wyatt had told her once, for being scrupulously fair. even in a territory where fairness often cost a lawman his position. He walked the perimeter of the barn with a lantern crouching here and there to examine the ground, his expression growing grimmer with every step. "Coal oil," he confirmed, finally straightening with a grunt. "Poured along the base 3 separate spots. Somebody wanted this to catch fast and catch thorough." He looked at Wyatt. "You got any notion who might have done this?" "I've got more than a notion, Sheriff. I've got a man who's been under investigation for forgery and fraud for the better part of a week, now humiliated in front of half the town on the courthouse steps. And a fire lit the very same night. His lawyer got word the Territorial Land Office was sending an examiner out personal to review his business dealings." "Ashford." Bragg's mouth thinned. "I'll want more than supposition, Marsh. You understand that." "There were tracks," Josephine said, suddenly remembering. "By the fence west side of the barn. I saw them when I was hauling water, only I didn't think anything of it at the time." Bragg followed her out to the spot lantern held low and crouched again, studying the ground with careful, practiced eyes. Boot prints, fresh, deep heel strike like a man wearing riding boots not built for walking far. He looked up. "Ashford's got a particular boot he favors, custom made out of Denver. I've seen the print before, matter of fact, at another piece of business I once had, caused to investigate out this way, though nothing ever came of it." "Then arrest him," Wyatt said low and hard. "I need more than a boot print to arrest a man like Gideon Ashford's son. He's got money for lawyers that'll tie this up in knots for a year if I move too quick without solid proof." Bragg straightened, dusting off his knees, his gaze moving over the smoking wreckage of the barn wall. "But I'll tell you what I can do. I'll take a plaster cast of that print tonight before the ground dries out and loses the shape of it. And I'll pay Mr. Ashford a personal visit come morning. See if his boots happen to match, and see if he's got a solid account of where he was tonight between the hours of 9 and midnight." "My. He'll have an alibi," Josephine said. "A man like that always does." "Maybe." Bragg's tired eyes met hers, something steady and reassuring in them, despite the grimness of the night. "But alibis crack easier than folks think, Mrs. Marsh, especially when a man's already unraveling under the weight of everything else piling up against him. You did good work catching him on the note. Let me do my work catching him on this." Boy. They rebuilt the north wall over the following days, the whole ranch pitching in hands, working double shifts. Mrs. Pruitt hauling meals out to the barn, so nobody had to stop for anything but water, and Josephine herself out there with a hammer in her hand, more often than a spoon. Driving nails alongside men twice her size, refusing every suggestion that she step back and let the menfolk handle it. "You don't have to do this," Wyatt told her the third day, watching her wipe sweat from her brow with the back of a hand already blistered from hammer work. "Neither do you, but here you are." "It's my ranch." "It's my home too, Wyatt Marsh. Or have you forgotten that particular detail somewhere between the fire and the fence mending?" She drove another nail hard, satisfying. "I didn't come 600 miles to sit on a porch and watch other people fix what's broken. I came to build something. This is just one more thing that needs building." Something in his face shifted soft and unguarded, and he crossed the space between them, and without a word of warning, kissed her quick and a little desperate, right there in front of God and the work crew and anybody who cared to look. Josephine froze for half a heartbeat, stunned before her hand came up and fisted in the front of his shirt, and she kissed him back with all the pent-up want she'd been carrying since that night on the porch when he'd pressed his lips into her palm and told her he wasn't making the same mistake twice. Somewhere behind them, one of the ranch hands let out a low whistle, and Mrs. Pruitt, standing nearby with a tray of biscuits, made a sound that might have been disapproval, and might just as easily have been the beginning of a laugh she was too proud to let loose. Wyatt pulled back, breathing unsteady, forehead resting against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the night you sat in Anna's chair and told me you weren't trying to replace her. You took your time about it. I had some things to work through first." His thumb traced along her jaw, gentle. "Grief doesn't let go easy, Josephine. But I think I finally understand what Mrs. Pruitt meant about a marriage being two people trading off who carries the heavy end. I think I've been letting you carry mine a good long while now, without ever once offering to carry any part of yours. You've carried plenty. Not enough. His eyes were serious now, steady on hers. Not near enough for what you deserve.
Key.
Sheriff Bragg returned 4 days later, and the news he brought settled over the ranch like the first real breath of relief they'd had in a week. Boot matched, he said, without preamble, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands. Mrs. Pruitt already pouring him coffee before he'd finished the sentence. Matched exact. And when I pressed him on his whereabouts that night, his story didn't hold up worth a damn. Said he was home all evening, but his own stable hand let slip without meaning to, that Ashford's horse came back lathered and blowing near midnight like it had been ridden hard and far. Is that enough to arrest him? Wyatt asked. It's enough to charge him with arson alongside the forgery charges already piling up from Judge Whitfield's investigation. Bragg took a long pull of his coffee, looking older and more tired than Josephine had seen him yet. Territorial Examiner finished his review of the note 2 days back. Confirmed everything you found the original terms, the forged call clause near 2 years of falsified feed deliveries, skimming profit off this ranch, and half a dozen others in the county. Once folks started looking close enough to notice their own numbers didn't add up right either. Half a dozen others. Josephine's eyebrows lifted. Turns out Ashford's little scheme wasn't limited to you, Marsh. Once word got out about what happened on those courthouse steps, 3 other ranchers came forward with ledgers of their own numbers that never quite made sense. Feed deliveries and interest charges that looked awful familiar once they knew what to look for. Bragg shook his head, something like grim satisfaction in the gesture. Seems Mr. Ashford has been building himself quite an empire off the backs of grieving distracted or simply trusting men for the better part of 5 years. Might have kept right on doing it too, if a mail-order bride from Kansas hadn't decided to read a ledger nobody else thought to question. Josephine felt Wyatt's hand find hers under the table, gripping tight. What happens to him now? She asked. Judge Whitfield set a formal hearing for 2 weeks out. Forgery, fraud, and now arson besides. Man's looking at serious time in the territorial prison, and every dollar he's stolen's like to be seized and returned to the folks he took it from once the accounting's done proper. Bragg set down his cup. And for what it's worth, Mrs. Marsh, the whole county's talking about what you did. Not just here in Stone Creek. Word's traveling clear to the territorial capital about the mail-order bride who caught the biggest crook this county's seen in a decade. I didn't do it for the talk, Sheriff. No, Bragg said, standing, settling his hat back on his head. I don't reckon you did. That's likely why the talk's so admiring. Loretta Ashford came to the ranch 3 days after her husband's formal arrest, thinner than Josephine remembered, but standing straighter than she ever had on that boardwalk, with her thin, performing smile. I've filed for divorce, she said, sitting stiff and proper in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she didn't drink. Judge Whitfield's agreed to expedite the proceeding given the circumstances. I'll keep the house at least until it's sold to settle Gideon's debts and what little's left of my own inheritance from before the marriage. Will you stay in Stone Creek? Josephine asked. I don't rightly know yet. Loretta's smile was tired but genuine. 20 years I've been Mrs. Gideon Ashford. I find I don't entirely know who I am without that name attached to me. But I intend to find out one way or another, and I find the notion doesn't frighten me half so much as it would have a month ago. You're welcome here, Wyatt said, whenever you've a mind to visit. This ranch owes you a debt it can't ever fully repay. You owe me nothing, Mr. Marsh. Loretta's eyes moved to Josephine, warm and grateful. It was your wife who gave me the courage to climb out that window. I expect I'll be repaying that particular debt for the rest of my life in one form or another. After she'd gone, Wyatt turned to Josephine, something thoughtful in his expression. My wife, he repeated slowly. She called you my wife. People have been calling me that since the day I arrived. I know. I just never rightly earned the right to hear it said that way before now. He reached for her hand. Josephine, I think it's time we made that particular fact a little more official then an arrangement written up quick and quiet the week you got here." Josephine's breath caught. "What are you saying, Wyatt Marsh?" "I'm saying I stood up in front of a preacher with you the week you arrived because a bank needed convincing, and a lonely man needed help keeping his ranch standing." Traced slow circles against her palm. "I'm saying I'd like the chance to stand up in front of that same preacher again this time, meaning every word of it the way it's supposed to be meant. Not because the bank needs convincing, because I love you, and I want the whole of Stone Creek to hear me say so out loud." Tears sprang hot and sudden to Josephine's eyes. "You never said that before." "The word love." "I know. I've been a coward about it, same as Loretta was a coward about her window for 20 years. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. "I love you, Josephine Callahan. I loved you somewhere between watching you carry your own trunk through a door I never should have let you carry it through alone, and watching you stand on those courthouse steps, telling the whole town you weren't afraid of a man who'd already run half of them into silence. I don't know the exact day it happened. I only know it happened, and I'm done pretending it hasn't." Chapter 8. The house changed in the weeks that followed, slow and careful the way a wound changes when it's finally allowed to heal, instead of being picked raw again and again. It was Mrs. Pruitt who suggested it first, standing in the front room one quiet evening, looking at Anna's portrait above the mantel, with an expression Josephine had never seen on her before, something soft, something at peace. "I think it's time," the older woman said. "We moved some things." Wyatt looked up from his chair wary. "Mrs. Pruitt, not all of it, Wyatt Marsh, don't go working yourself into a state." She crossed to the mantel, touching the frame of Anna's portrait with gentle fingers. "But this house has been a museum 3 years too long, and Anna Marsh was never a woman who'd have wanted her memory kept behind glass while the living folks around her forgot how to breathe. I think she'd want her portrait moved to your bedroom somewhere private, somewhere you can visit her memory without the whole house being built around grief instead of living." Wyatt was quiet a long moment, his eyes moving from the portrait to Josephine sitting beside him with her hand resting light on his knee. "What do you think?" he asked her. "I think," Josephine said carefully, "that loving me doesn't have to mean forgetting her. I think there's room in a house, same as there's room in a heart for grief and joy, both to live side by side, so long as neither one's asked to hide itself away to make room for the other." Wyatt stood slow and crossed to the mantel himself, lifting the portrait down with careful hands. "I loved her," he said quiet. "I'll go on loving the memory of her long as I live. But I think I've spent 3 years mistaking keeping her memory alive for keeping this whole house frozen solid, and those ain't the same thing at all." He carried the portrait down the hall himself, and when he came back something had settled in him, some final piece of tension Josephine hadn't fully realized he was still carrying finally set down. The shawl came next, folded properly now, not left out, as though waiting for a hand that would never reach for it again, but placed carefully in a cedar chest, alongside Anna's boots and her hairbrush. And the book left open on the side table, closed now, its place marked with a ribbon, honored instead of haunted. And the front bedroom, the one Wyatt had told her that very first day she'd never be permitted to sleep in, became theirs together, aired out, refreshed, made new, without erasing what had come before, the way a house becomes a home again after it's been allowed, finally, to breathe. So, the wedding took place on a bright, cold Saturday 3 weeks later in the little white church at the heart of Stone Creek, and Josephine stood at the front of it in a dress Mrs. Pruitt had helped her sew. Blue as the Colorado sky, cut generous and beautiful, made to fit the body she actually had, instead of one she'd been told her whole life she ought to shrink herself into. The church was fuller, Wyatt told her afterward, than it had been for any wedding in Stone Creek in years. Ray Coulter sat near the front with his wife and his boy, the very same boy who'd once received medicine from Anna's kitchen without ever being asked to pay for it. Loretta sat a few rows back, dressed plain, but proud, tears streaming freely down her face throughout the entire ceremony. Even the women who'd tittered cruelly on the boardwalk that first day sat in the pews now, watching with something that looked unmistakably like genuine happiness. "You look terrified," Josephine whispered to Wyatt as they stood together at the front of the church waiting for the preacher to begin. "I am terrified," he whispered back. "Terrified I don't deserve half of what I'm about to be given." "You deserve every bit of it, Wyatt Marsh." She squeezed his hand. "So do I come to that. I spent 29 years being told I was too much of everything to be somebody's whole world. Turns out I just needed the right somebody to stop counting what I was too much of and start counting all the ways I was exactly enough." The preacher began, and the vows they spoke that day were nothing like the quick practical arrangement made in that same church weeks before every word chosen, every promise meant. And when Wyatt finally kissed her in front of the whole congregation, the whole of Stone Creek erupted into applause loud enough to rattle the windows. Mrs. Pruitt cried through the entire ceremony and denied it fiercely afterward, dabbing furiously at her eyes with a handkerchief she claimed was only there on account of the dust. Anna would be glad, she told Josephine quietly at the small gathering held afterward in the churchyard, the autumn light gold and warm, despite the season's chill. "I know that for certain now, in a way I wasn't certain of before." She'd be glad her Wyatt found somebody who could love him whole, instead of loving only the careful, guarded pieces he let himself show the world. "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt, for everything. For trusting me eventually, even when you had every reason not to." "Don't thank me for that." Mrs. Pruitt's chin lifted proud and fierce. "You earned that trust yourself, Josephine Marsh, every single day since you climbed off that stagecoach and walked a mile up a dusty road with your own trunk on your hip because nobody thought to come meet you halfway." Her weathered hand found Josephine's gripping tight. "This ranch is lucky to have you. This whole town is lucky to have you, though it took the fools long enough to realize it." That evening, as the last of the wedding guests finally took their leave and the ranch settled into quiet, Josephine stood on the porch in the very chair that had once belonged only to Anna's memory. Now simply a chair on a porch, belonging to a home two people had chosen to build together, and watched the sun go down, gold and orange, over the Colorado mountains. Wyatt came and sat on the step below her, same as he had that first quiet night when he'd finally told her about Anna. And this time, when he reached for her hand, there was nothing careful or guarded in the gesture at all. 6 months ago," Josephine said softly, "I was a woman half this town had already decided wasn't worth a second glance standing on a porch waiting to be told I didn't belong." 6 months ago," Wyatt said, "I was a man who'd forgotten how to want anything sitting in a house built more for grieving than for living." He pressed a kiss against her knuckles. "Funny how much can change once somebody's brave enough to stop waiting for permission to build something new. Ashford thought he could break us. Thought a woman my size, a man as broken as you were, wouldn't have the sand to fight back. Ashford was wrong about a great many things, Josephine Marsh. That was only the first of them." Wyatt looked up at her gray eyes, soft in the dying light, and there was nothing left in them of the tired, resigned stranger who'd shaken her hand that first day, like touching her too long might mean something he wasn't ready for. "I reckon he's sitting in a cell right about now waiting on his hearing, wondering how a mail-order bride from Kansas managed to unravel 5 years of careful scheming inside of a single month. He underestimated the wrong woman." "He underestimated the right woman entirely," Wyatt corrected, gentle, certain. "And this whole ranch, this whole town is better for it." Josephine leaned down and kissed him, slow and unhurried. No longer a stranger measuring the shape of a life she hadn't chosen, but a wife home, at last, in a house that had finally learned how to hold both grief and joy without asking either one to disappear. Judge Whitfield's formal hearing convened on a cold morning 2 weeks after the wedding, and Stone Creek's little courthouse filled past its walls, folks standing 3 deep along the back rail and spilling out onto the steps to hear the proceedings relayed, sentence by sentence, from those near enough the door to listen. Josephine sat beside Wyatt in the second row, her hand tucked tight in his, and watched Gideon Ashford stand before the bench in a coat far plainer than the fine one he'd worn that first day at the ranch gate. His silver hair unkempt, his composure finally entirely gone. "Mr. Ashford," Judge Whitfield said, his voice carrying flat and final across the packed room. "This court has reviewed sworn testimony forensic examination of the altered promissory note, corroborating statements from no fewer than 6 witnesses, and physical evidence tying you directly to an act of arson committed against the Marsh property. The pattern here is not one of a single lapse in judgment. It is the pattern of a man who built a fortune deliberately upon the grief and vulnerability of his neighbors." Ashford said nothing. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed somewhere past the judge's shoulder on the wall on nothing at all. "You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge on charges of forgery, fraud, and arson." Whitfield continued, "Every dollar recovered from your accounts will be returned to the ranchers you defrauded in amounts to be determined by this court's accounting, beginning with full restitution to Wyatt and Josephine Marsh, whose evidence made this entire proceeding possible." A murmur swept the courtroom, not of shock, but of something like satisfaction, long overdue. Ashford turned finally and found Josephine's eyes across the crowded room. Whatever he meant to say, whatever venom he still carried, seemed to die somewhere behind his teeth. He only looked at her a long moment and then looked away, and the marshal led him out through a side door before he found any words at all. "It's over," Wyatt said quietly, once the gavel had fallen and the room had begun to empty around them. "It's over," Josephine agreed. But she found sitting there in the thinning crowd, with her husband's hand warm around hers, that the words didn't feel like the end of anything. They felt like the beginning of the part of their life that finally belonged to them alone. Word of the Ashford trial traveled faster and further than either of them expected. Within a month, letters began arriving at the ranch from ranchers 2 counties over, men who'd heard the story secondhand and thirdhand, asking whether Mrs. Marsh might be willing to look over a puzzling ledger or 2 of their own. "You've built yourself a reputation," Wyatt told her one evening, watching her pore over a borrowed set of books spread across the kitchen table, a rancher named Higgins having ridden 2 full days to bring them to her personally. "I've built myself a headache is what I've built," Josephine said, though she was smiling as she said it, tracing a column of figures with the tip of her pencil. "Mr. Higgins, here's your trouble. Your foreman's been marking down twice the salt allotment your herd could possibly need, and pocketing the difference selling it on to the mine camp outside Butte." Higgins, a broad-weathered man twice her age, stared at the ledger like she'd performed a magic trick in front of him. "How in the world did you see that so quick? I've had that book in front of me a dozen times and never caught it." "You weren't looking for it, Mr. Higgins. Most honest men don't think to look for dishonesty in the people they trust. That's precisely why dishonest men count on it." Josephine closed the ledger and slid it back across the table. "I'd have a quiet word with your bank before you confront your foreman if I were you. Get your figures straight from an outside source first, so there's no denying it once it's said aloud." Higgins left an hour later, profusely grateful, promising to send word of how it all turned out, and Wyatt watched him ride off down the drive with an expression Josephine couldn't quite read. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He shook his head, smiling. "Only thinking how far you've come from a woman standing in my kitchen, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake coming out here." "I never wondered that." "You did, first night. I saw it on your face, even though you never said a word of it out loud." He crossed the kitchen and pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm glad you didn't turn around and go home, Josephine Marsh. I don't know what kind of man I'd have become if you had. Probably a very lonely one sitting in a house full of somebody else's shawls." "Probably." He agreed and kissed her slow and easy, the way a man kisses his wife, when there's no more urgency to it than simple ordinary happiness. The ranch itself flourished in ways neither of them had quite dared hope for that first hard summer. With Ashford's theft finally stopped and the falsified debts wiped clean by the court's restitution order, the money that had been quietly bleeding out of Walker Ridge for 2 years began instead to stay where it belonged. Wyatt hired on 2 more hands. Come spring, expanded the herd, put in a second well that finally solved the water troubles that had plagued the south pasture since before Anna's time. Josephine turned her attention to the house itself, and then gradually to the town beyond it. She started small, a Sunday supper here, a batch of bread sent over to a struggling family there, but within a year, what had begun as simple neighborliness had become something the whole of Stone Creek had come to rely on. It was Mrs. Pruitt who suggested one autumn evening over supper that Josephine ought to make it official. "You've been feeding half this county already, whether you call it charity or just being neighborly," the older woman said. "Might as well put a proper name to it and let folks know where to bring their troubles." "What would I even call such a thing?" "Call it what it is." Mrs. Pruitt shrugged, matter of fact. "A place where a person who's been cheated or lied to or scared into silence knows they can come and find somebody who'll actually listen and actually help." The idea took root, slow then, all at once, the way good ideas often do. By the following spring, a small room off the Stone Creek General Store had become an informal gathering place, 2 afternoons a week, where Josephine sat with ledgers spread before her and a steady stream of townsfolk ranchers worried about their books. Widows confused by confusing bank correspondence, young men just starting out, who didn't yet know how easily a dishonest man could take advantage of their inexperience. She never charged a dime for it. She didn't need to. Wyatt's ranch provided well enough for both of them, and Josephine had never forgotten what it felt like to be a stranger in a strange town, with nobody willing to look past her appearance long enough to see what she actually had to offer. "You've become something of an institution," Wyatt told her, amused one evening, as she recounted the day's visitors over supper, 3 ranchers, a widow, and a young clerk from the bank himself, seeking advice on how to spot the kind of fraud he was terrified he might be helping perpetrate without realizing it. "I've become a woman who likes numbers and doesn't like bullies," Josephine said. "The rest is just people needing somewhere to bring both those problems." Anna would have loved this, Mrs. Pruitt said quietly from her seat at the end of the table, and there was no sadness in the words anymore, only a kind of settled, grateful peace. She always said this ranch ought to mean something to the whole valley, not just to the family living on it. Took the right woman finally arriving to make that particular dream come true. Loretta Ashford. She'd taken back her maiden name. Loretta Hayes, once the divorce was finalized, became a frequent visitor to the ranch, and over the following year, something unexpected bloomed between her and Josephine. Not merely gratitude, but genuine friendship, the kind neither woman had quite expected to find at this stage of their lives. "I've decided to stay in Stone Creek," Loretta announced one afternoon, arriving unannounced with a basket of preserves and an expression Josephine hadn't seen on her before, something lighter. Freer, the careful mask of the banker's wife, entirely gone. "I've taken a position teaching at the schoolhouse. Seems all those years managing Gideon's correspondence taught me a fair bit about reading and figures, whether I meant to learn it or not. The children are lucky to have you. I rather think I'm lucky to have them." Loretta set her basket down, smiling. "Do you know, I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd buried playing the part of Mrs. Ashford all those years. Took losing everything I thought I had to finally find out who I actually was underneath it." "You were always that woman, Loretta. You just needed somewhere safe to let her out. Perhaps?" Loretta's eyes were warm, grateful. "You gave me that somewhere, Josephine Marsh, whether you meant to or not. I don't imagine I'll ever stop being thankful for it." Ray Coulter's fortunes turned too in the wake of the trial. His testimony, given at real personal risk, earned him not only the community's respect, but a modest reward from the restitution fund the territorial court established for witnesses who'd come forward against Ashford's schemes. He used it to buy out a small parcel of land adjoining his existing lease, and within 2 years, the man who'd once shuffled nervously outside the general store, terrified of Ashford's reach, had built himself into one of the more respected small ranchers in the valley. A transformation he told Wyatt once that he owed entirely to a moment of courage he still could hardly believe he'd found. "Wouldn't have found it," Coulter admitted, "if your wife hadn't looked me dead in the eye that day outside the livery and asked if I'd swear to the truth." Something about the way she asked made refusing feel like the harder thing to live with. 2 years passed. Then, 3 and Walker Ridge Ranch. Wyatt had taken to calling it that, a small tribute to the woman who'd made it whole again, settled into the particular rhythm of a life well and honestly built, Josephine's advisory work at the general store grew into something larger still. Word had spread far enough beyond Stone Creek that a delegation from the territorial capital arrived one summer asking whether she might be willing to consult on new banking regulations meant to prevent exactly the kind of fraud Ashford had perpetrated for years. They want to write laws based on what you figured out with a ledger and a stubborn streak, Wyatt told her, grinning after the delegation had departed with pages of her notes tucked carefully into their satchels. Somebody ought to make it harder for the next Ashford to try the same trick twice. Somebody did. You did. He pulled her close on the porch, the same porch where a dead woman's shawl had once sat folded and untouched, now simply a porch where a living happy couple sat most evenings watching the sun go down. I used to think this ranch's whole story was written the day Anna died. Turns out it was only half finished. Took you arriving to write the rest of it. I didn't write it alone. No, he agreed. But you're the reason there was anything left worth writing. The town itself had changed too, in ways large and small over those years. The women who'd once tittered at Josephine on the boardwalk had over time become some of her most devoted friends, not because they'd forgotten their unkindness, but because Josephine had never once thrown it back in their faces, choosing instead to simply be exactly who she was, steady and generous and unbothered by old grudges, until the shame of their earlier judgment quietly faded beneath the weight of her ordinary, consistent kindness. At the Stone Creek Founders' Day celebration, 5 years after her arrival, Josephine stood at the edge of the town square, watching the whole community gathered together, ranchers and shopkeepers. The schoolteacher who'd once been Mrs. Ashford Ray Coulter, proudly showing off his expanded herd to anyone who'd listen. Sheriff Bragg trading stories with Judge Whitfield, who made a point of visiting Stone Creek every year around this time, claiming the town had become, in his words, considerably more interesting to oversee since the Ashford affair. Mayor Higgins, the very same rancher whose foreman Josephine had once caught skimming salt allotments, now elected to lead the town's small council, stood at the front of the square and raised his glass. 5 years ago, he began, this town nearly lost one of its finest ranches to a man who thought the law existed only to serve those with money enough to bend it. 5 years ago, a woman arrived in this town that some of us, to our shame, judged before we ever bothered to know her. His eyes found Josephine across the crowd, warm and unguarded. I'd like to think this town's learned something in the years since. I know I have. Mrs. Marsh, on behalf of Stone Creek, I want to say plainly what should have been said the very day you arrived: welcome home. The square erupted into applause, and Josephine felt tears sting hot behind her eyes. Wyatt's arm coming around her shoulders, steady and proud. Any words for the town, Mrs. Marsh? Higgins called, grinning, and the crowd took up the call, urging her forward. Josephine hesitated only a moment before stepping up onto the small platform, looking out over the faces of the people who had once looked at her and seen only a burden, a mistake, a woman too large and too plain to belong anywhere fine. When I arrived in Stone Creek, she said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the square, I was told more than once that I didn't fit the shape of what this town expected, that I was too much of one thing and not enough of another. She paused, letting the words settle. I've come to understand in the years since that being told you don't fit a shape somebody else drew for you isn't a judgment on your worth. It's simply proof that the shape was too small to begin with. A ripple of soft laughter and nodding moved through the crowd. This town gave me a chance to prove that even when it took some of you longer than others to offer it. I'm grateful for every one of you who eventually did. And I hope whatever any of us look like, however any of us arrive in this life, through hardship, through grief, through simple bad luck, that Stone Creek remembers what it learned the hard way. That a person's worth was never about to be measured by the space they take up in a room. It's measured by what they're willing to give once they're finally let inside it. The applause that followed was louder than anything that had come before it, and Wyatt was there the moment she stepped down, pulling her into his arms, pride and love shining plain and unhidden on his face for the whole town to see. That night, after the celebration had wound down and the ranch had settled quiet around them, Josephine and Wyatt sat together on the porch, same as they had 100 nights before, watching stars scatter bright across the wide Montana, no Colorado sky. The mountains dark and steady on the horizon. "Higgins wasn't wrong," Wyatt said quietly, "about this being home for you now. It's been home a long while, Wyatt. Longer than I think either of us realized that first hard week. I remember standing on that porch the day you arrived," he admitted, "thinking I'd made a terrible mistake sending for a stranger. Thinking I was asking some poor woman to walk into a house I'd turned into a tomb and calling it a marriage." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't understand yet that I hadn't sent for a stranger at all. I'd sent for exactly the person this ranch and this town and this stubborn, grieving heart of mine needed all along. I just wasn't wise enough yet to see it. You're wise enough now. I'm wise enough to know better than to ever let you go, if that's what you mean." He turned to face her, fully taking both her hands in his. 5 years, Josephine. 5 years since you climbed off that stagecoach with your trunk on your hip because nobody thought to come meet you halfway. I think about that image more than you'd guess, a woman walking a mile up a dusty road alone, refusing to be discouraged by a world that hadn't bothered to show up for her yet. His thumb traced slow circles against her knuckles. "I want you to know plain and clear that I've spent every day since trying to make sure you never have to walk anything alone again. Not because you need saving. You never needed saving, not for one single day since you arrived. But because a woman who walks that far alone deserves at the very least somebody willing to walk the rest of the road beside her." Josephine's throat tightened, tears bright and unashamed in her eyes. "That's the finest thing you've ever said to me, Wyatt Marsh." "I've got finer things left to say," he promised, "if you'll give me the rest of a lifetime to say them in. I intend to hold you to that." So, the years that followed only deepened what had begun that first summer. Walker Ridge became known throughout the territory not merely as a successful ranch, but as a place where fairness and honesty were simply understood to be the cost of doing business. A reputation built stone by careful stone from the very ledger Josephine had first spread across a kitchen table, determined to prove that a lonely rancher's misfortune had never been misfortune at all, but theft dressed up cleverly enough to fool a grieving man too exhausted to look closely. Mrs. Pruitt lived out her years at the ranch, refusing every gentle suggestion that she might like to retire somewhere easier on her joints, insisting the kitchen at Walker Ridge was the only kitchen in the territory that still knew how to properly season a pot of beans. She grew old, surrounded by the family she'd helped build from grief and stubbornness and second chances. And when she finally passed peaceful and unafraid in her own bed on a quiet winter morning, many years later, the whole of Stone Creek turned out for her service a testament to just how thoroughly she'd woven herself into the fabric of the community she'd once guarded so fiercely. Gideon Ashford served his full sentence at the territorial prison, and by the time he was finally released, gray and diminished, the fortune he'd built on forged signatures and stolen feed money had long since been redistributed to the very ranchers he'd once considered too weak or too distracted to notice his thievery. He left the territory quietly without fanfare, and Stone Creek, by unspoken agreement, simply let him go without another word spoken about him. Some victories, Josephine had come to understand, didn't need a final confrontation to feel complete. Sometimes justice was simply a man's name fading slowly out of conversation until nobody thought to mention it at all. Loretta Hayes taught 3 decades of Stone Creek children their letters and their figures, and more than one grown rancher in the valley credited her with teaching them, alongside their arithmetic, the particular value of double-checking a column of numbers before trusting a stranger's word about what those numbers meant. She never remarried content, she told Josephine more than once, to have finally built a life entirely her own after 20 wasted years of building someone else's. Ray Coulter's small parcel of land grew generation by generation into one of the most respected operations in the valley, and the story of his testimony against Ashford became something of a local legend, proof folks like to say that even the most frightened man could find courage enough to do right, given the proper reason and the proper company standing beside him. And Wyatt and Josephine Marsh built on the foundation of a ranch that had once been little more than a shrine to grief. A life that neither of them could have imagined possible. That first hard summer, full, honest, generous, built on partnership rather than obligation, on choice, rather than arrangement, on the particular hard-won understanding that love was never a reward for shrinking yourself small enough to be easily accepted. It was instead the simple, steady recognition of exactly who a person already was offered freely, without condition, by somebody finally wise enough to see the whole of them clearly. Late in her life, long after the ranch had passed its finest years and settled into the comfortable, well-worn rhythm of a home built to last generations, Josephine would sometimes sit on that same porch, in that same chair, that had once belonged only to a dead woman's memory, and think back on the woman who'd climbed off a stagecoach in Stone Creek with nothing but a trunk and a stubborn refusal to be discouraged. She thought of the shawl folded on the chair, the boots by the door, the portrait above the mantel of a woman she'd never had the chance to meet, but had come over the years to think of, with nothing but gratitude for the love Anna had given a lonely man, and for the space, ultimately, that love had made room for. Once it was finally allowed to become memory instead of monument. She thought of Mrs. Pruitt's suspicious eyes that first morning, softening slowly over weeks and months into genuine affection. She thought of Loretta climbing out a window in the dark, terrified, and finally gloriously free. She thought of Ray Coulter's shaking hands passing over a stolen ledger outside a livery stable, and the whole town gathered on courthouse steps, watching a bully's careful lies collapse in real time. She thought most of all of Wyatt, the tired stranger who'd shaken her hand like touching her too long might mean something he wasn't ready for. Transformed slowly, patiently, honestly into a man who never once in all their years together made her feel like anything less than exactly enough. Stone Creek remembered Josephine Marsh in the decades that followed, not as the mail-order bride who'd arrived unwelcome and unexpected at a lonely rancher's gate, but as the woman who'd walked a mile up a dusty road alone because nobody thought to meet her halfway, and had spent every day since making certain nobody in her town ever had to walk that same road without somebody willing to walk beside them. She had come to Stone Creek believing she was traveling toward a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement between two lonely strangers. She left behind instead a legacy that outlasted every unkind word ever spoken about the shape of her body or the size of her ambitions. Proof plain and undeniable, carved into the very fabric of a town that had once judged her and lived to be grateful it hadn't succeeded in driving her away. A person's worth was never about to be measured by what the world assumed at first glance. It was measured always by what remained standing long after the assuming was through steady, generous, and entirely unapologetically enough.